A lot of times when people experience pain in the shoulder, they blame it on the rotator cuff. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the rotator cuff from an anatomy standpoint, from a function standpoint, and then some of the common misconceptions around how we go about potentially alleviating pain in the rotator cuff and or just around the shoulder in general. So first things first, the rotator cuff is basically a composition of a couple of different muscles that sit around the shoulder blade and the upper arm. The first is going to be the subscapularis, which sits underneath of the scapula and runs up into the inner side of the arm. The others basically sit on top or behind the scapula in the supraspinatus on top here, as well as the teres minor and the infraspinatus on the back. And those are the four primary rotator cuff stabilizers, or muscles that play a direct role in what we call the rotator cuff function, which is essentially just to keep these two things together, right? So I have this model here just so we can kind of orient ourselves, right? This is generally speaking where the average scapula will look to sit, where the average humerus and clavicle will look to sit. And the function of these muscles is basically to hug the humerus, basically the ball on the top of the upper arm, and keep it centered or centrated in the actual socket of the upper arm as we go through different motions. So as the arm comes up and the scapula needs to sort of move with the arm in various directions, the function of the rotator cuff is essentially to keep those things together, i.e. to keep the joint held tight as we go through different activities, and as other muscles like the pecs, the lats, and the delts pull the arm in various directions. So something that's really important to understand is that a lot of people treat the rotator cuff as if its function were simply just to create rotation. And while in a textbook you may read that, okay, teres minor and infraspinatus, they do this, they're external rotators, that's really only from one joint position, and it's seldom the case that in the weight room we're looking to actually isolate and train that motion. So my theory on all of this kind of rotator cuff stuff and why a lot of these typical rotation-based exercises, whether it's in this plane or in this plane, don't really give a lot of people tremendous amounts of relief, is because it operates, or at least the sort of solution to the pain, the rotator cuff pain that people are feeling, oftentimes operates off of a false premise to begin with, that the rotator cuff is in fact the primary issue. I've seen this countless times where people will go to physical therapy, they'll be prescribed all these different kinds of weird internal external rotation activities to no avail and to no pain relief as soon as at least they start to go back into the gym and start to load things. So we might start to question that a little bit and say, okay, well, if we really understand that, like from a physics-based perspective, the role of these guys is, as I mentioned earlier, not to necessarily create rotation, although they can do that, but because they sit so close to the joint, and if you were to look at any sort of like 3D anatomy model, what you would see is these guys basically hug the humerus to the scapula, and they hug the humerus to the scapula in various joint positions. And in some of those joint positions, i.e. something like this, they don't really even create very much rotation, right? Like if you were to bring your arm up sort of out to the side here, other muscles like the rear delts, for example, would be in a better position than something like the teres or the infraspinatus to create that external rotation, or the pecs in the case of internal rotation, right in this position. So although those muscles will always function to a very small degree in those rotational roles, the way that the architecture of the tissues sort of combines and works together is such that because they sit so close together and hug the bone so closely, that their main role is really, again, to keep this thing together at all costs, again, under the conditions where pecs, lats, all those bigger muscles are actually pulling on the joints. And so when we think about remedies for rotator cuff pain, which is obviously very generalized and sort of a tangential discussion of its own, I more look to things like, okay, how are we setting up our major exercises? How are we setting up our presses? How are we setting up our pulls? How are we executing these things? What is the tempo that we're using? Are we using a load that's appropriate, right? I think a lot of people skip over the step of what do our exercises look like? How are we executing these things? Are we using appropriate loads? And are we using appropriate arm paths for the specific goals that we're trying to use? Just to pick one example of about 20 that we could talk about, I often find that with presses, people find themselves using this really up and wide arm path, this sort of guillotine style bench press with a super big arch with a barbell. I mean, that's just one example of many that we could call upon to say, this may be problematic from just a general health standpoint, a general joint health standpoint, specifically because of the kinds of force demands that are imposed in that specific situation. And yet we don't really look at that as the problem. we look at that as, as an exercise that we all should be able to do for some reason, and instead we say, okay, well, it's not the bench press that's, creating all these issues, even though I have a tremendous amount of pain after I bench press. It's actually the rotator cuff, which is actually just too weak to stabilize me in something like a bench press, right? Which to me is a beyond ridiculous sentiment. So from the perspective of like what to do, why shouldn't we train this and train this? I don't think we should not train those motions necessarily, but I think that we should look toward other things as alternative solutions to begin with and in the first place. So for example, working on our execution as far as presses and pulls go, making sure that from a joint health perspective, those things are prioritized in the higher magnitude force exercises first before we start to look at smaller tissues and before we start to blame individual tissues for specific issues. So I find that this happens a lot just in personal training and in physical therapy as a whole, which is simply just this idea of like we're going to pick on this one muscle and we're going to blame this muscle for all of these problems that we're experiencing, rather than looking at the more higher magnitude items on our list and saying, okay, are these things set up in a way? Are these things being executed in a way? Are we doing an appropriate amount of volume for what we can handle? Because oftentimes what I find is I don't really tend to address rotator cuff specifically, right? I really tend to address again, those higher magnitude items. And what happens is because we end up loading muscles like the pecs, the delts, and the lats proportionately more, biceps, triceps as well, we end up actually taking force away from what the rotator cuff may actually have to do from a stability standpoint. So if you put your primary movers, we'll call them primary movers, in presses and pulls in poor mechanical positions to actually function properly as they're supposed to, then oftentimes what happens is these other tiny tissues, again, the tissues that are really just trying to hug this joint together in various positions, a lot of load will actually get put on those tissues that maybe wouldn't have been there otherwise. So again, tons of examples. The bench press just happened to be the first that came to mind, but something like a bench press for a lot of different people ends up being a very, very high risk exercise from a joint stability and a joint management standpoint. A lot of people simply can't handle the amount of force that they're supposed to be able to produce through their pecs and through their delts and through their triceps. And so a lot of it gets deferred to things like rotator cuff, and we end up blaming the rotator cuff for having to deal with this amount of force, rather than understanding that like we're simply just putting those other bigger tissues in a worse position to actually act on the load, i.e. in that more abducted, fixed grip implement position, right? So a lot of different examples like that, and that's personally why I find a lot of these compound type exercises to be potentially problematic for people, is they're just forcing their joints into particular positions by using fixed implements and by assuming that they have to use particular ranges of motion, that those smaller guys, again, that surround the rotator cuff are tasked to do much more work than they're actually meant to in the first place. So again, the solution would just more simply be, let's address these higher magnitude items, and then maybe as a secondary, tertiary sort of option, look to rotator cuff specific strength. But in my personal experience, although my personal experience is of course biased like everyone else's, I find that rotator cuff specific exercises have a very low rate of success as far as pain relief, pain reduction in general, especially if you don't look to address those other bigger items first. So that's pretty much my perspective on rotator cuff stuff. As far as why it tends not to work, is because there are these other higher magnitude things that we go unaddressed in the context of only addressing again the rotational force-based things. And if you want to learn more about, potentially how to properly set up exercises from an execution standpoint, from a tempo standpoint, definitely look into my online course, which basically has 15 hours now of content, which I'm constantly updating and constantly refining to teach you and to teach you how to teach your clients how to set things up appropriately for them and their structure and their needs and their tolerance. So definitely check that out if you are interested, and or if you are frustrated about having to deal with all these rotator cuff issues yourself or in your clients. And I think you'll get a lot out of that.